2 days after the Maine exploded, before a single diver had gone down to examine the wreck, before a single witness had testified before the Naval Court of Inquiry, before any physical evidence had been gathered or analyzed, William Randolph's Hearst New York Journal published his verdict. Spain did it. The headline ran across the full width of the front page. Below it, a detailed account of the explosion, complete with diagrams, illustrations, and expert opinions, all pointing to a Spanish mine. None of it was based on an investigation. All of it was based on what sold newspapers. In part 1, we told you the story of what happened. In part 2, we're going to tell you what actually happened, and how the most powerful newspaper proprietors in American history used 260 dead sailors to manufacture a war. To understand what happened to the coverage of the Maine, you have to understand the men who covered it and what they were fighting over. By 1895, two of the most powerful newspaper proprietors in American history were locked in a circulation war of extraordinary ferocity. Williams Randolph Hearst, heir to the California mining fortune, had bought the New York Journal in 1895 and immediately began poaching Pulitzer's best reporters, editors, and even his comic strip characters. Joseph Pulitzer, who had built the New York World into the largest circulating newspaper in the country, responded by matching every escalation. The two papers drove each other towards more sensational coverage, bigger headlines, more dramatic illustrations, more emotionally charged language. Cuba, where a genuine and brutal conflict was unfolding, was the perfect story for this kind of journalism. It had real victims, real villains, real drama. All it needed was amplification. Hearst amplified it systematically. He sent his best writers and the celebrated illustrator Frederick Remington to Cuba to cover the story. The most famous anecdote of this period, perhaps of all American journalism history, is the alleged telegram exchange between Remington and Hearst. Remington, finding Havana quiet and the expected drama absent, supposedly cabled Hearst, "Everything is quiet. There is no trouble here. There will be no war. I wish to return." And Hearst allegedly replied, "Please remain. You furnish the pictures, and I'll furnish the war." Hearst denied the exchange ever happened. No original telegram have been found. Historians have debated the story's authenticity for decades. But here's the thing. Whether or not Hearst actually sent that telegram, it actually described what his newspaper did. The Journal sent reporters to Cuba to find a war. When the war was quieter than expected, the Journal ran stories as if it weren't. When Spanish atrocities were real, and many were, the Journal amplified them beyond any documentary basis. And when the Maine exploded, the Journal responded not as a news organization trying to determine what had happened, but as a campaign organization that had already decided what had happened and needed the facts to catch up. The day after the explosion, the Journal ran a $50,000 reward offer from Hearst personally for information leading to the conviction of the criminals who destroyed the Maine. A reward for convicting criminals whose existence had not yet been established, for a crime that had not yet been investigated. The verdict was in before the trial began. The newspaper coverage of the Maine's destruction was not merely sensational. In many cases, it was fabricated. Within days of the explosion, the Journal had published detailed diagrams of the Spanish mine that had allegedly sunk the Maine, including its design, its placement, and the mechanism by which it had been detonated. None of this was sourced to any investigation. The diagrams were illustrations, not evidence. The confidence with which they presented was total. The World, not to be outdone, published its own expert analysis of how the mine had worked. It quoted naval officers, often without their names, often with their statements taken out of context or simply invented, to support the Maine narrative. Headlines like "Maine explosion caused by bomb or torpedo" ran with question marks that the surrounding text did not honor. The stories themselves asserted Spanish culpability as a established fact. Meanwhile, the actual Naval Court of Inquiry was reaching a more complicated conclusion. The court's divers did find evidence consistent with an external explosion, a section of the hull that appeared to be bent inwards rather than outwards, suggesting that force had come from outside the ship. On this basis, they concluded that a mine was a probable cause. But the court also found significant evidence that complicated this picture. The pattern of damage to the ship was not entirely consistent with a standard mine. No mine fragments were recovered. No evidence of a mine cable or anchoring mechanism was found. And critically, the Spanish investigation concluded simultaneously, reaching the exact opposite conclusion. Internal explosion, no mine. One voice that cut through the noise at the time was the New York Times, which was not participating in the Yellow Press competition. The Times ran a measured editorial 2 days after the explosion, suggesting the cause was likely accidental. It was ignored. The Times was outsold by the Journal and the World by ratios of 10-1 in the weeks that followed. The official investigation's conclusion that a mine had caused the explosion was accepted by the public and the government, not because the evidence was conclusive, but because the newspapers had spent weeks making any other conclusion seem naive or cowardice. To doubt the mine theory was to be soft on Spain. To call for more investigation was to dishonor the dead. President McKinley's own court of inquiry, in his official report, explicitly declined to assign blame. That disclaimer was buried. The mine finding was amplified into a Spanish atrocity. That investigation of the Maine was not the last word on the Maine. The wreckage was investigated 3 more times, and each time the political context of the investigation shaped its conclusion. In 1911, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers raised the Maine's wreckage from the bottom of Havana Harbor. A second board of inquiry examined the newly accessible remains. It reached essentially the same conclusion as 1898. External explosion consistent with a mine. The wreck was then towed out to sea and sunk in deeper waters, ending any further physical examination. Historians and naval engineers spent the following decades noting problems with the mine theory. The most fundamental was thermodynamics. The pattern of damage to the Maine's hull was inconsistent with how mines of that era behaved. Mines created a specific signature of explosion, a bubble of gas expanding against the hull, creating characteristic damage patterns. The Maine's damage did not match those patterns cleanly. There was also the question of motive and logic. Spain was desperately trying to avoid war with the United States in early 1898. The McKinley administration had been pressuring Spain to reform its Cuba policy, and Spain had been making concessions. Blowing up an American warship in Havana Harbor, Spain's own port, under the eyes of witnesses, would have been the most irrational act Spain could have possibly committed. It guaranteed the war that Spain was trying to prevent. In 1974, and then more definitively in 1976, Admiral Hyman Rickover, one of the most technologically distinguished naval officers in American history, the father of the nuclear submarine program, conducted a private investigation of the Maine using modern analytical methods. His team applied computer modeling, heat transfer analysis, and the accumulated knowledge of a century of marine engineering to the available evidence. Their conclusion was unambiguous. The Maine was almost certainly destroyed by an internal explosion, a coal bunker fire. The ship's coal bunkers were in direct contact with her forward ammunition magazines, a known design flaw of ships of that era. Had the igniting magazine and it produced 2 explosions that witnesses described. Coal bunker fires were not unusual in steam-powered ships of the 1890s. They were a documented hazard, caused by a spontaneous combustion of a certain type of coal under certain type of storage conditions. The Maine had been using a type of coal known to be prone to this problem. She had experienced elevated temperatures in her coal bunkers in the days before the explosion, a detail that the original court of inquiry had noted and not pursued. Rickover was careful with his phrasing. He said, "almost certainly." The evidence was not absolute. No definitive proof of exactly what happened could be established after the wreck had been disturbed by 2 previous investigations and sunk in deep waters. But his conclusion was that of the weight of evidence strongly favored internal explosion, and that the 1898 investigation had reached the wrong conclusion under immense political pressure to find an external cause. The Yellow Press did not cause the Spanish-American War alone. The underlying conditions, the Cuban crisis, the genuine atrocities of Spanish reconcentration policy, the American appetite for imperial expansion, the McKinley administration's diplomatic failures, all of those were real. The war might have come regardless, but the Yellow Press determined the timing and the pretext. It took an unexplained explosion and converted it, within 48 hours and without evidence, into a Spanish act of war. It drowned out the voices, including Captain Sigsbee's own voice, from the deck of the ship that had just blown up, calling for suspended judgment. It made a political cost of a peaceful resolution too high for McKinley to pay, even when his own diplomats were telling him Spain was about to meet the American demands. Hearst understood exactly what he had done. The war was declared. He ran an editorial in the journal underlining his own byline. "How do you like the journal's war?" it asked. The journal's war killed 3,289 Americans. It killed an unknowable number of Spaniards. It handed the Philippines to a new colonial power that fought a brutal 9-year counterinsurgency war against the population it had normally liberated, killing somewhere between 250,000 and 1 million Filipinos. It established the template for American imperial expansion that would define the next half-century of foreign policy. In 1976, 78 years after the explosion, 3 years after the end of Vietnam, a year after the Church Committee had revealed the CIA's covert operations, and the public was in a mood to reassert official narratives, Admiral Rickover published his findings. Coal bunker fire, internal explosion, no Spanish mine, no Spanish attack. The investigation that should have been done in 1898, done properly without political pressure, had finally been done. Its conclusion was that the war had begun with an accident, and that the accident had been converted into a casus belli by men who understood that a confused public, given a clear and satisfying villain, would not ask too many questions. They were right. The public did not ask too many questions. The war came. The empire came with it. The men who built the narrative, Hearst and Pulitzer, whose names today adorn a journalism award and a university, died rich and celebrated. The lessons of the USS Maine is not that government always lies about the cause of wars, though sometimes they do. The lesson is simpler and more durable than that. The lesson is what happens when the institution responsible for questioning official narratives decide instead to build them. When the press stops asking, "What actually happened?" and starts asking, "What story will sell?" The public loses the one tool it has to evaluate whether the war being proposed in its name is built on solid ground. In 1898, the tool failed completely. 260 American sailors were dead, and before anyone had established why, their deaths had been converted into a war. Remember the Maine. Just remember it accurately.